This video will change the way you knit. Or maybe it won't. Honestly, I couldn't care less about how you decide to knit because the result will stay the same. But what I do care about is your comfort and your enjoyment of your knitting experience. So let me tell you why I chose to knit continental. When I started knitting, I was holding my yarn in my right hand, just like my grandma did and the people that I saw knitting around me did. That's the way most people do it in Quebec. To be honest, I didn't even know there were other ways to hold your yarn or your needles. Then I discovered the magic of color work, and I discovered that you could hold your yarn two at a time, one in one hand and one in the other. So I kind of forced myself to learn continental during that time. After doing a few projects, I put a challenge upon myself basically to knit a full project continental. And so I chose a hat, something simple and quick that I could only knit continental on. And after that, I was hooked. I just never looked back. Why did I want to change the way I knit? I didn't really want to change. I just wanted to try. It felt good. I liked the flow. I liked that it minimized my hand movement and that it made me faster. Don't get me wrong. Knitting fast is not the ultimate goal. It should not be your first goal in knitting. Getting a beautiful finished product and enjoying your time knitting it should really be the one goal, but what happens when you knit in a way that is comfortable to you is that ultimately you're gonna get faster at it. So it's basically a win-win. You get more comfortable, you get more speed. So if you'd like to give continental a go, or if you've tried it before and it didn't quite work, here are my tips on how I like to knit continental. To knit continental, I will obviously have my yarn on my left-hand side, and the way you will tension your yarn will greatly depend on you, but here's how I do it. I weave the yarn like so. So it goes from over my pointer finger, under my two middle fingers, and over the little finger. And when I close my hand like this, it traps my yarn quite well, so it can flow easily, but it's not completely loose either. I used to actually turn it around like this, but now with experience, I've figured that this was a better tension for me. So explore those options. I see a lot of people knitting continental with the finger in the air here, which probably is one of the reasons why they feel like they need to wrap the yarn a lot more, because it creates less friction when your finger's in the air and your hand is open like this, whereas the way I'm doing it, my hand is much more closed on my work, which creates more friction against my fingers, and so I have to have less, twirling of the yarn. I'm here. I keep my finger really close to my hand, so it's kind of resting on my middle finger here, and that's what creates for me the most fluid motion. On the first stitch, sometimes I'll have to use my middle finger to help the yarn a little bit on that first stitch, but then my pointer will remain very close to the rest of my fingers. And yes, sometimes it'll happen that this will start drifting off, but then with control, I can kind of make my finger come back close and start knitting. If you want to see the motion in real, like slow-mo, you can, just put the video on a 0.5 time speed, or you can go check my learn how to knit a dishcloth video. I do both English style and continental style. But today, for little tips, what ends up happening is that finger is really resting and is not doing much. So I pack all my stitches close to the point of my needle. I hold them in my hand here, and I'm helping them along by holding the fabric with my thumb and my middle finger, and the pointer finger is just kind of resting there, and my needle is actually kind of grazing the tip of my finger to come and pick the yarn. And by doing that, it's really can really go fast, and my motions are very small. And you can notice that my finger actually seems to be doing some moving here, but the motion of that finger just happens because of me moving my yarn. So I'm not really moving my finger, it's just the yarn pulling on it and releasing it when I move this needle here. So a lot of people think that because they're right-handed, they should be knitting English style, and if they're left-handed, they should be knitting continental. But my left hand is really not doing much at all in a knit stitch. It's really my right hand that's scooping up this yarn. Scoop, 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 and the right hand finger is just relaxing there for the scooping to happen, and it's just very relaxed so it can move with the motion of my yarn. So really knitting comfortably means having a really low amount of tension. So for me, knitting here creates muscle strain in the forearm. So for me, it's not a great way to knit. And so by resting everything here, really the only place that are moving, I'm creating this light motion, mostly all in my wrists. And yes, there is a wrist movement, and sometimes I help my movement by bringing my wrist together and away, together and away, together and away, but it's very slight. And then obviously I'm helping the stitches along with my right hand as well to kind of move them away from the tip to be able to keep knitting the other stitches, which creates this quite fluid motion here. And you can see how that motion can get really fast without necessarily forcing the speed. It just kind of happens. When it comes to holding my yarn for the purling motion, which is what usually people have the most issues with, there are many ways to do the purl stitch in continental, but for me, my way that works well for me is to bring the yarn forward and to actually do this loop around with my pointer finger. So what I'll do is I stick my needle in, and then I'm not working only with my finger because that would be really difficult. If I try and bring my yarn forward with my finger, it's gonna slide. I can't even do it. So what I do is, yes, I bring my finger down, but I twist my wrists. So see how my wrist goes up, this one here, in order to bring that yarn across. So by bringing that wrist up, and I do the same thing with this hand, but a slightly less, up, what happens is this, my needle is going up and my yarn is getting trapped behind before I bring it down. Because if I don't, then my yarn doesn't want to go behind. It wants to stay in front, and it becomes really difficult to bring it behind and then over. Whereas here, I'm bringing the needle in front, the yarn is already trapped behind, and then I rotate my wrist and bring down my finger to bring it through. So it becomes quite fluid as well for me. Obviously, the more I talk, the less I concentrate. You can see how this motion can get pretty easy by practicing it. This is my way of purling. Obviously, there are many others. Some people like to Norwegian purl, which means that you bring your You keep your yarn in the back, you bring your needle behind, you bring your needle in the stitch, you pass it in the back, and you bring it back around to the front and through. So keep the yarn back, go pick it up as if you were doing a knit, bring it forward and pass it in that hole. But for me personally, I feel like this is more motions in the end than doing my push stitch. Another way would be to use the middle finger to push, so that finger stays kind of resting, the index finger stays resting on the middle finger. But personally, I find this method to be a little bit more difficult for me. So then again, personal preferences. The yarn also has a tendency to flow more freely when I do the purl stitches. So here I'm going to be on a, technically I would be on a knit row of a stockinette, but I'll do a purl row again to show you. When I'm here, like you see my hand opens up a lot more. So all of this here, all that section of yarn doesn't have any friction. So sometimes, depending on the yarn, the purl stitches will have a tendency to, the yarn will have a tendency to flow a little bit more freely, but this to me is enough. You might want to wrap around for the purl stitches only, maybe, but then if you do ribbing, that's going to become a little complicated for the tension. That being said, the tension for my stitches is made by using my needle, not by the amount of tension I put on my yarn. So it doesn't really matter how I'm twisting against my fingers. My stitches should always be the same size because the needle is gauging the size of the stitches and not my tension. That's a subject for probably another video. But here it is, my purling. And then when it comes time to do some ribbing, it's very easy to purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. Sometimes in the ribbing motion, my finger moves a bit more in the knit stitch than it does when I'm doing stockinette, just because it's already moving. So it's going to kind of give a little push to the yarn. Here, I'll sometimes bring it through a little bit more. But I really just do what feels comfortable for the stitch I'm doing, for the yarn I'm using. Nothing is 100% always the same. So that's it. Those are my tips for today. Let me know in the comments if you will give it a go or if it's just not for you. Either way, I really hope you stick around to watch some more of my videos because I have a lot of tips to share, and this one in particular will show you my top tip to become a better knitter. Have a great day. Happy knitting.